Good evening and welcome again to another episode in this series we're doing every Sunday evening at 8:15, where we are interviewing, by and large, ministers who are in their 70s and 80s and have retired now or semi-retired, and we are talking to them about their life, how they became a Christian, their ministry, and the times where they have really proved God over the years, the struggles they've had, and then their advice for the church and what they see the need of the hour. And tonight is a real privilege to welcome the Rev Bruce Powell. And like I say every week, and I say this every week, there's nothing slick or professional about what we're doing on a Sunday night. It's just three men in different parts of the country having a chat. And so get a cup of tea and maybe a piece of toast and sit back and just listen in for the next 45 minutes. But it is a huge privilege to have Mr. Powell tonight. And Mr. Powell, as I was growing up, played a big part in my childhood, really, because his church, Castle Street, was just a few miles from where my home church was. And so our young people had lots to do with each other. And Mr. Powell was also the conference secretary in Aberystwyth for many, many, many years. And so it's really, really nice to have you tonight, Mr. Powell. And I wondered if you could start off by just telling us a bit about yourself, how you became a Christian, and your ministry. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Alan, for the welcome. It's a joy, a privilege to be with you. I'd just like to say at the very outset, I'm just a poor sinner saved by God's free and sovereign grace. So I trust that anything I say will be to his glory. I was born in 1941 in the autumn of that year in Newport. I was the second son and the second child of my parents. They only had two children, and they were faithful members of Malpas Road Presbyterian or Calvinistic Methodist Church, which in those days was known as the Malpas Hall, because it was a forward movement hall like the Heath in Cardiff and many other halls in South Wales. I was baptized at 3 weeks old and grew up in the church and in a God-fearing home. Although my parents, faithful church members, like many other faithful church members at that time, were unconverted. The gospel was not clearly preached week by week, and I didn't grow up under the clear, regular preaching of the gospel. But I did grow up certainly being taken to chapel week by week and being involved in every aspect of the life of the church. I was baptized at 3 weeks old, and so, as I say, the chapel became very much part of my life from those very, very early days. My early memories, because it was 1941, were of bombs falling and air raid shelters and barrage balloons in the air. And one very pleasant memory was of American soldiers passing the chapel in their open-top trucks on a Sunday afternoon, making their way to an American airbase just up the road from where the chapel was situated. And they would throw oranges to us children as we stood outside the chapel after Sunday school. Now, oranges were quite scarce then. I don't know where the Americans got them, but they certainly seemed to have plenty of them. So that was a very happy memory. My early spiritual influences, I can distinctly remember at the age of 6 being convicted of sins. I'm not talking about conviction of sin, but I was certainly convicted of sins. I was very much aware of when I had done wrong, and I was very troubled. And I remember a teacher in school, I think she must have been a Christian, telling us about the conscience and telling us that if we were very sinful, we would lose the use of the conscience. And I was convinced there and then that I'd lost the use of my conscience because I was so sinful. And then another influence upon me in very early days was in Sunday school. The Sunday school superintendent was obviously a converted man. And before we went to our classes, he used to pray at some considerable length. And always in his prayer, he would pray that God would unstop our ears and open our eyes so that we may hear and see the truth. Unfortunately, there was very little truth spoken in the classes, but that prayer stayed with me and just made me realize, I think, as I was growing up, that something really needed to happen to me. Something really needed to happen to me spiritually. So it had that effect upon me. And then at the age of 12, Dr. Marshall Lloyd-Jones made a visit to the chapel, as was his wont to visit many chapels in Wales midweek. And I was at that time in the Boys Brigade, and it was a Boys Brigade evening, so we were all marched in to the packed chapel. Seats had to be kept for us, and the chapel was actually absolutely heaving with people. But he preached on the rich fool from Luke 12, and I remember it so well. It made a colossal impression upon me, so much so that the next day I told the boys in school about it. And the doctor had stressed the need to be ready to die and face God. And I asked the boys in school if they were ready to die and face God, not in any way thinking that I wasn't ready, because I wasn't. I mean, I wasn't converted, but it didn't somehow apply to me. But I was eager to apply it to others. And then we also had a Boys Brigade captain at that time who was a converted man, and he spoke from time to time about knowing the Lord Jesus. So I heard something of the need to know him from the Boys Brigade captain. And then another influence, or another kind of spiritual experience I remember in those early days was when I was about 15. We were on holiday, just a family holiday in the Mumbles, and on one of the beaches there was a beach mission, and I remember seeing this young lady about 17, 18 years of age leading these children in the singing of choruses, and I thought how beautiful she was. And but it wasn't just the physical, although obviously that was involved, but there was a purity about her. It seemed as if her face was shining. And within myself, I said, that's what I want to be. I want to be pure like that, because I felt dirty, on the inside. And I felt I really want to be pure as that young lady is pure. But for all that, in those teenage years, I was a typical Pharisee. At 14, I became a church member. At 16, I became a Sunday school teacher. At 17, I became a youth leader. At 19, I became a local preacher. But I was unconverted, clearly unconverted. I preached the law. I urged people to obey the law and be good so that they could please God. I loved every aspect of church life. I had no interest whatsoever in dancing or alcohol or smoking. I couldn't understand how anyone could be so stupid as to spend money on these things. As I say, I was just a typical Pharisee. Even I remember thanking God when I was in school, thanking God that I was not like other boys who were not able to pray, because I was able to pray. That's the kind of spirit it was that kind of horrible Pharisaic spirit within me. But for all that, spiritual realities certainly did not dominate. It was money and wealth that dominated. As I was growing up in those teenage years, I was consumed with ambition to do well, to make lots of money as quickly as possible, and to be somebody. And so for this reason, I left school at 16 in order to make as much money as in as short a time as possible. And at that time, when I was about to leave school, the old minister of the church one Sunday said, "Oh, I hear you're leaving school. What are you going to do?" So I said, "Well, I'm thinking of training to be a civil engineer, because there were huge opportunities in rebuilding programs after the war for civil engineers at that time. So I knew that if I went into civil engineering, I could very quickly do very well." "Oh," he said, "I always thought that you would become a minister." That's how he spoke. And then he said, "Oh," he said, "I can just see it now." He said, "I can just see it. The Reverend Bruce Powell. I can just see it." He said, "You know, I always thought you'd be a minister." And I thought, I didn't say it, but I thought, perish the thought. That's the worst paid job in the world. I'll never be a minister, never. But his words just sunk deep within me, and I could not get away from them. Whatever I did from then on, from time to time, those words would come back to me. The ministry, the ministry. You should be a minister. So that's why I say that I was called to the ministry at 16. It was something very real and powerful, although I rejected it, I suppressed it, I didn't want it, I turned away from it, but I couldn't get away from it. Well, I started work in civil engineering training, of course, and consumed with ambition. Because I was so consumed with ambition, I refused to follow the normal route of part-time study at technical college. I thought that I could tackle the professional exams directly and get qualified more quickly. And so I did a correspondence course, but despite hours and hours and hours of work, I was very quickly way out of my depth, and failure of exams ensued. This was very humbling. I wasn't used to failing, but God was looking back. God was obviously in it. It was, I would say, the beginning of a humbling process. And then after a few years, when I was about 19, for some reason, I couldn't account for it, but for some reason, I had an overwhelming desire to seriously read the Bible. Now, I'd never seriously read the Bible, even though, you know, I was a Sunday school teacher, local preacher, and so on, but I'd never seriously read the Bible. I'd only just dipped into it. And so every evening at about 9:30, after, you know, engineering studies, I would put the studies aside and I would take my Bible, and I began in the New Testament, and I came very quickly to Matthew 7 and verse 21. "Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven." And I was quietly shattered by those words. I thought, not everyone, just hit me. Not everyone. All my life I'd been saying, "Lord, Lord," and here it was, not everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," shall enter the kingdom of heaven. And as I say, I was just shattered by it, and the bottom dropped out of my world. I became very subdued. Some might say depressed, although I wasn't clinically depressed. But it was obviously the beginning of conviction of sin, as distinct from conviction of sins. You know, conviction of sin is the awareness, not just that you've done certain things that you shouldn't have done. It's the awareness of being altogether wrong and altogether in a wrong relationship with God. And although I couldn't have expressed it, obviously that was what was happening to me. And the men in work in the office where I worked began to ask, well, what's the matter? And also at that time, at the same time, the name of Christ became precious to me, which I couldn't understand. When men blasphemed up to that time in the office, it didn't bother me at all. But now when they blasphemed, as they often did, I felt cut to the quick. I felt cut to the heart. I was really upset and troubled, and I couldn't understand why. And that went on for months. And so by this time I was moving towards 20 years of age. And then one Saturday I was in town, and I went into Smith's, and I thought, I've got to buy something that's going to help me. So I went to the religious section, and I saw this little paperback, Letters to Young Churches by J.B. Phillips. It's a paraphrase of the New Testament letters, and a paperback, bright colored paperbacks. So I bought it. I thought, well, I can read it on the bus going back and forth to work. Nobody will know it's the Bible, so I won't be embarrassed. And so that's what I did. And it wasn't long before I came to Romans chapter 8 and verse 9, which J.B. Phillips paraphrases: you cannot be a Christian at all unless you have something of the Spirit of Christ within you. And as I read those words, I just knew that I had become a Christian. I thought, that's it. That's what's happened to me. I've become a Christian. All that's been going on these past months, I've become a Christian. That's what's happened to me. The Spirit of God has come to dwell within me, and I've become a Christian. And I knew beyond any shadow of doubt. I mean, I was vague on the person of Christ. I was vague on the atonement. I was vague on justification by faith alone. I was vague on the person of God himself even. But I knew I'd become a Christian. And so I jumped off the bus at the appropriate stop. I ran into the office, ran up the stairs, and I wanted to shout, I've become a Christian. I didn't. Courage failed me. So I rejoiced quietly. But then the thoughts of the ministry returned in power, that which I'd been suppressing. Of course, I was no longer now suppressing, and it was now welcomed. Now, the next year was 1962, which was very significant in Malpas Road, because it was the year that Hugh Morgan came to be our new pastor. The old pastor had retired, and Hugh Morgan came to be the pastor, a man on fire, an amazing, remarkable ministry. And the first year was very significant for my own family. My father was converted, who by that time was an elder, but still unconverted, but he was converted during the first year of Hugh's ministry. My brother and his wife were both converted during that first year, and my mother a year or so later. I soon went to see him and explained my doctrinal ignorance, although I knew I was a Christian. The assurance was still very strong, but I said, I just know nothing. So he immediately gave me a copy of the Westminster Confession. Now, I assume he gave me that because he didn't have a copy of the Calvinistic Methodist Confession to hand, but they're very similar. And I soon acquired the Calvinistic Methodist Confession as well. But I began reading the Westminster Confession, and I was just bowled over. I thought, this is absolutely wonderful. This is what I believe. And I felt it in my bones. I felt it so deeply and so strongly. In fact, I felt it so strongly that I began reading parts of it. I took it to work with me, and I began reading parts of it during the coffee break to the men in the office, the 4 or 5 men in the drawing office. And much of their consternation, but they were very patient with me. But one of them was a Jehovah's Witness. And as soon as I began to read the Westminster Confession, he went berserk. He was so angry. He went red in the face, and was very, very resistant. But that just, in my naivety, that just confirmed to me I was reading the truth. So I carried on. But as I say, he was always so angry. Anyway, it's a couple of months.
Tell us about your did you go to Bible college then, Bruce?
I'm just coming to that now.
Oh,
I'm just coming.
good.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of months later, I went to see Hugh Morton again and told him I felt I was called to the ministry. He said, go away and forget it, come back. But if you can't forget it, come back in 3 months. But if you can forget it, well, don't come back. So I did exactly as he said. 3 months later, I was back seeing him. I said, I can't forget it. He said, no, I know. He said, I'm sure that you're called to the ministry. He said, I felt that for some time. So, but there I said, look, I don't want to go through the denominational channels at the moment. I knew that they would require 7 years of liberal studies. And I said, I can't face it. I said, I'm so ignorant of the Bible. I said, I can't face 7 years of liberal studies. So I said, I'd like to go to Bible college for a few years and then apply to the denomination. So he agreed. He said, fine. So he said, right, well, we'll say nothing about you being a candidate for the ministry in case the denomination sort of react and play up. You just go to Bible college. So I went to I'd heard vaguely about the London Bible College, so I went to the London Bible College. The attraction of London, of course, was that I could sit under the ministry of Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones at Westminster Chapel. So that was why I was so keen to go to London rather than anywhere else for Bible college. So I went to Bible college in 1963 to the London Bible College for a 3-year course. I'll come quickly over that. It was during my first year that something very significant happened to me, which I must mention because it's been significant in the whole of my life since. May the 1st, 1964, at about I was in a prayer meeting in central London, and about 3:30 in the afternoon, God came down. God came down. The Holy Spirit came down. I was aware of something happening to me personally. The Lord Jesus Christ was more real. There was nothing new as far as truth was concerned, but there was a totally new dimension. The deity of Christ was absolutely certain. I knew that he is God. I obviously by then I was believing strongly that he is God, but that time when God came down, I knew beyond any shadow of doubt that he is God, the one true and living God. And I found my whole being going out to him and praising him and worshiping him, glorifying him as I beheld him by faith upon his throne in glory. His blood was more real than ever before. I knew that my sins were forgiven. I knew that he was Lord of all. There was overflowing joy. There was liberty and freedom in my spirit, the freedom of the sons of God. And as I say, it was just an overwhelming experience of God.
Was that for you, Bruce, or did others have the same?
Oh, there were others who, yes, not everyone, but there were others. Yes, awesome. Yes, indeed. But the interesting thing was that I believe God spoke to me clearly at that time, and I couldn't get away. I can't explain it, but I couldn't get away from these words: hold fast to that which you have heard from the beginning. Now, I could only interpret that in one way. That was the Westminster Confession. That was the truth I'd heard from the beginning of my Christian life. That was the truth that was the first truth, as it were, the first body of truth that was presented to me. So I had no doubt whatever that was what this hold fast to that which I'd heard from the beginning was referring to in my particular case. And I think God was being very, very gracious and saying in effect, well, now, yes, you have this experience, but you don't live on experience. You live on truth personified in Christ. You feed on the bread of life. You don't feed on experiences. And I feel that's what God was saying. That's been a tremendous help ever since. I'd heard of revival, I believed in revival, I prayed for revival, I'd read Ivian's book on the 1859 revival, but it was something far distant. But now it was something seemingly within me. I felt now I knew at least in some little way, in some little measure, what revival was all about. And I felt I'd entered into this new dimension, as it were, which I'd not known before. And as I say, the whole of my Christian life was affected. I mean, there was a tremendous increase in longing for revival. There was more liberty in preaching, there was more liberty in personal witness, and more liberty in living the Christian life. I went to see Dr. Lloyd Jones as soon as possible to tell him about what had happened and so on. And I said, I don't understand it sort of theologically well. He said, there's no problem. He said, the Spirit has been poured out upon you, he said, But I said, if that's the case, you see, in my naivety, I said, well, if that's the case, why am I not like Howell Harris and Daniel Rowland? He said. So he said, but he said, they knew the Spirit poured out upon them in a time of revival, in a time of general revival. In other words, it was a matter of the measure, They knew the Spirit poured out in a far, far, far greater measure than I had known. So that was the only way I could sort of understand that.
Bruce, can you take us now to your ministry then, the churches you went to?
I'm just coming to that now, yes, indeed.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah, indeed, quite. I worked harder, I pushed myself, and during that summer, at the end of the first year, I engaged in evangelism, preaching and so on. But by the time I returned to college in my second year, I was totally exhausted. I was only there a couple of weeks and I collapsed. And I had to have a break. And the principal kindly sent me to some friends of his down in Brighton. And I was walking one day there near the sea, and this reference came powerfully into my mind, Deuteronomy 10 and verse 16. And I thought, oh, it's bound to be a promise of help and one of God's fear nots and so on. But I had a pocket Bible, and what a shock I had when I looked at it. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stiff-necked. But I was given grace to see what was happening through this difficulty and through this collapse. I was being humbled, and that was necessary. God was humbling me, and we need to be humbled. There's no usefulness without brokenness.
We're frozen.
And I could see that that's what God was doing. Painful way it was. I mean, because it lasted for another 2 years. And so I limped through the next 2 years in a very weak state. But my understanding of people broadened enormously. It was all part of training for the ministry, but it was a humbling process. I went on a regular basis to see Dr. Lloyd Jones, and he was so helpful. He said, come and see me at least twice a term, and tell the deacon in charge of the queue that you've got an appointment, you won't have to wait, you come straight in. And he just sat me down and talked to me, sometimes for 20 minutes, and there were people, a lot of people waiting. I sometimes felt quite embarrassed. I was taking so much time, but he was just so kind and so generous with his time, and used to talk to me as if I was, sometimes the only friend he had. It's quite ridiculous from that point of view, but that was his kindness and his generosity, and it's such a tremendous help. And then 1965, he spoke at the Puritan Conference on ecclesiola in ecclesia, the little church within the church, the whole issue of being in it to win it, in the denomination to win it, and showed that all this was not a New Testament teaching. And I was convinced from that I should not go into the denomination. So in the spring of 1966, I again told the doctor that I felt I should stay outside of the denomination. He said, quite right, stay outside. The Great Division is coming and you'll be on the right side. But I said, what am I to do? Well, he said, go and see David Mingard of the FIC. Tell him I sent you. So I also asked him about whether I should have further training, because I felt that I should. I felt so unprepared and so inadequate. And I said, well, what about colleges in America? So he spoke about Covenant College for a minute, and then he suddenly stopped. And he said, listen, you don't need any more training. You've got the word, you've got the spirit, now get out and preach the gospel. So I went to see David Mingard, the FIC, who was very helpful. And he had been to just been to a congregational church in Hertfordshire, who had applied to join the FIC because they'd seceded from the old denomination, and they were looking for a pastor. Now, he had 100 men on his books looking for pastorates, but he said, the problem is, he said, they're all Baptists. He said, are you a Baptist? So I said, no, my background is Calvinistic Methodism, same as Dr. Lloyd Jones. I said, no, I'm not a Baptist. Well, he said, shall I send your name to this church in Hertfordshire who want a pastor? I said, yeah, by all means. So within 3 weeks, I was preaching at Bruffing and Puckeridge Congregational Church. 3 weeks later, they invited me back. And then shortly after that, they invited me to become their pastor. So I went to meet the deacons and accepted the pastorate. And I was returning on the train to London from Ware to Liverpool Street, and I was in a compartment on my own, and I felt so dejected. I thought, what have I done? I've accepted this pastorate in this remote village in Hertfordshire. I always felt that I was called to the industrial valleys of Wales, and here I am accepting a pastorate in the remote villages of Hertfordshire. And I felt so dejected. I thought, how am I going to manage going there on my own? My nearest friends would be 20 miles away, and I had no form of transport. And I said I was just overwhelmed. But then suddenly, in that railway carriage, there was such an overwhelming sense of God, very suddenly. And these words came flooding into my mind. Faint not nor fear, his arms are near, he changeth not, and thou art dear. Only believe, and thou shalt see that Christ is all in all to thee. It's the last verse of Fight the Good Fight. And I knew then, that it was all right, that I could go forward and God would be with me. So that's what I did. So on the 25th of September 1966, I began my ministry at Bruffing and Puckeridge Congregational Church.
So in your ministries then, Bruce, you've had 3 ministries.
Yes.
What have been the good things that have happened to you, and any difficulties you'd like to talk about and how you came through them?
Yes, oh well, a lot of good things, yes. A lot of very wonderful things, yes. I mean, there were very early encouragements in the first pastorate. Just a couple of weeks after I started, the Aberfan disaster took place.
Oh, yeah.
I remember. Terrible, terrible disaster. Well, as a consequence of that, 2 new people came to the chapel on a Sunday evening. One of the chapels, the chapel in Puckeridge, that was the larger of the 2 villages that I served. There were 2 young women around the 30 mark, 2 characters. One was the local prostitute, known as such in the village. She had a daughter who came to our Sunday school, and the other one was a real character who worked in a local factory. But they started coming, and they said when they saw the terrible disaster and the children killed, they had to come to chapel. That's how they put it. So they started coming, and within quite a short time, God began to work. In fact, second or third Sunday, I think they were there. The one of them, the factory worker, who I say was quite a character, she went storming out of the chapel and walking down the high street where the chapel was situated and shouting at the top of her voice, "Who does that man think he is, telling me I'm a sinner? I'm never going there again." But she was there the next Sunday. And continued to come with a friend, who, as I say, was the prostitute, soon the ex-prostitute. She stopped the trading pretty quickly, and well, eventually they were both converted and became church members. So that was very encouraging. And then there was a Welsh-speaking Welsh lady from a village just outside Aberystwyth who was in the congregation. She used to come one Sunday night to chapel, and then the other Sunday night she'd go to the village hall to play bingo. So she alternated, you see. And but she started coming a little bit more regularly to chapel. And then she stopped me one day in the village, and she said, she said, I never knew I had to be justified by faith. I'd started going through Galatians, and I never knew I had to be justified by faith. But she said, "No, I see from what you're preaching." And slowly but surely, she came through and was a tremendous help. So that was that was very very wonderful. There were 3 lessons which I learned particularly in that first pastorate. One was the reality of the devil and his opposition to ministry. Quite early on, I was beset by a terrible fear. I couldn't knock a door without trembling and hoping that nobody would answer, so I wouldn't have to face anybody. That was how terribly fearful I was, and so much so that I eventually borrowed a car and went out to my friends in North London, which were the nearest friends I had, and shared with them. And they called a few people together, and they prayed and discerned that I was troubled by this was satanic onslaught. This was the devil trying to destroy my ministry. But God met with us again in that meeting in a very powerful way, and I was wonderfully delivered, and again found myself praising him and glorifying him, and I knew I was delivered. It was just very, very wonderful. I mean, there were obviously still many attacks afterwards, but never to the degree of that initial onslaught. And then also another lesson learned was how the Lord provides. I felt prompted to send a gift to somebody who was still in college whom I knew had no grant. And I argued, as it were, within myself, "Oh Lord, I've only got a little saving. I'm trying to save to buy a car. I need a car to go around these villages and so on and so on." At any rate, I was so pressurized within myself that I sent a gift. I think about half my savings, which wasn't very much. I mean, don't get the wrong impression. It wasn't a huge gift. And the very next day, I was visiting and one home, and a door opened opposite, an old lady, a member of the church. She said, "When you finish there, come over here." So I duly did as I was told. I went into the house and she said, "Listen," she said, "Mr. So-and-so down the road is selling his car, and I'm going to buy it for you, and I'm going to give you 10 shillings a week to help you run it." Well, 10 shillings a week at that time was 5% of my stipend. I mean, my stipend was £10 a week. So, I mean, 10 shillings a week was a considerable help, and it enabled me to run the car,
Yes.
So there we are. So immediately it came flooding into my mind, "Give and it shall be given unto you."
Yeah.
I thought, well,
Yes.
the Lord will provide,
Yeah.
And the first 5 years in the ministry, I mean, my stipend never covered my essential expenses, but I never lacked. The Lord always provided through family and friends, and gifts and so on. I never had to ask anybody for anything.
Bruce, you've mentioned two men who were influential in your life, the doctor and Hugh Morgan.
Yes.
Were there other men who had a serious influence upon you?
Yes.
Any books that you'd like to suggest?
Yes. Alvin Davis had also a great influence on me. I used to see him regularly. And books, oh gosh, yes, there's so many. But the first reading I ever did was through Westminster Record, Westminster Chapel, was the doctor's sermons on Christian warfare, and that was a tremendous help. And I've read it several times since, and it's always a tremendous help. I heartily recommend that. A colossal impression upon me. And then later on, the Doctor's Spiritual Depression had a tremendous impression upon me. And Preaching and Preachers, absolutely essential reading for ministers, I would say. That had a tremendous impression upon me. Archibald Alexander, Thoughts on Religious Experience, tremendous help I got from that. Burgos Systematic Theology, and I've mentioned the Westminster Confession, which is bound in a volume with the Catechism, the larger Catechism, the shorter Catechism, the Directory of Worship. I return to that time and time again. That's had a colossal influence upon me. And the Calvinistic Methodist Confession of Faith. I read and reread that again regularly. I would urge particularly ministers always to be reading one of the great confessions of faith on a regular basis, just to keep yourself reminded of the overall system of doctrine taught in the scriptures. And of course, there are many systematic theologies now which are extremely helpful. John Payton, Missionary to the New Hebrides, again, outstanding missionary biography that had a tremendous influence upon me. William Carey by Piers Carey, likewise. The Methodist Fathers, thankfully now translated into English, that's had a tremendous influence upon me. History of revivals, of course. There's Ivan's books on the 04 revival, the 1859 revival, but there's so many others.
Yes.
Northern Notion, the Shropshire revival, Jonathan Edwards, Religious Affections, and Narrative of Surprising Conversions. They had quite a huge influence upon me. And most of Ian Murray's books actually have had an influence upon me. I think his his 2-volume biography of the Doctor, I'm sure that must be the greatest 20th century Christian biography. It really must be one of the greatest biographies ever written, I would have thought.
Yes, it is good. Yes. So what advice, Bruce, would you give to yourself now, as a young man starting?
Well, of course,
what advice would you give?
I've said nothing about my 2 other pastorates, have I?
No.
I suppose we haven't got time. Well, I had the pastorate in Trevigo where we knew considerable blessing. That was great, and Loughborough was very wonderful. My years there. Things which I know now, which I wish I knew when I was younger. Well, what I discovered throughout the ministry was that in the ministry you constantly need the strength of youth and the wisdom of old age, but of course they never come together. Of course, so there's always this frustration. Looking back, I wish I'd been more humble. I wish I'd known greater brokenness. I wish I'd had a greater servant spirit. When I was younger, I think I was quite ruthless. And I think I failed to encourage people on a personal level as much as I should have done. Some people are great encouragers, and I think that's very, very important. I think a man like Stuart Olliott, I was in college with Stuart, so I knew him when he was 20 years of age. He was outstanding then, and he's been outstanding ever since. But whenever you speak to Stuart, he's always got a word of encouragement. And I think that's great. That's just great. Yeah. So I wish I'd been a greater encourager. It's as I say, with regard to what I'd like to say to others and pass on advice. Well, advice to younger men. Well, Jonathan Edwards' great statement is always relevant, isn't it? That church's business in any generation is to know in which way the sovereign Redeemer is moving and to move in that direction. Seek to know what God is doing in your generation and move with Him. Seek to move with God. Of course, that requires a close walk with God. You've got to keep in touch with God. So the first things must always be the first things. We give ourselves to prayer and the ministry of the word, and it's that order. So often that's quoted the wrong way around. People say, "Oh, we give ourselves to the ministry of the word and prayer." No, that's not what Acts 6 says. It says we give ourselves to prayer and the ministry of the word. There's a priority there, which is vitally important. Then I would say, remember the devil. Never forget the devil. He will always be seeking to hinder you. He will always be seeking to trip you up. He will always be seeking to cause you to fall to fierce temptations. The fierce temptations of the ministry, particularly, money, power, and sex. And sadly, good men, very good men have fallen. And the devil is so active, so subtle. So watch and pray. Yes. Be on guard. And then I would say, make sure you are you really are preaching the gospel and not just preaching about the gospel. I think that's often what happens these days. Men preach far more about the gospel than they actually preach the gospel, you know.
Okay.
And I think that's vitally important. Spell it out. Don't be afraid to spell it out. Rehearse it. You know, who has believed our report? It's a report. You know, rehearse it. You know, the incarnation, the life, the ministry, the death, the resurrection of Christ. Spell it out, and the atonement, the propitiation, Christ, our propitiation, and then confront people, you know, with their sin. That seems to be missing these days. You know, confront people, you know, and show them that they're sinners. You know, explain, you know, what the law of God requires in detail, and you know, bring them before the wrath of God against sin and against all ungodliness. You know, it's the bad news before the good news. You know, but make it clear, spell it out. Don't hold back, I would say.
Right.
And make sure that the Christians, you know, are hearing the gospel regularly. Christians need to hear the gospel. You know, that there needs to be the call to repentance to Christians as well as the converted. You know, we need to confess our sins on a regular basis. We need to keep short accounts with God. But that happens when the gospel is faithfully preached and there's a faithful, strong call to repentance on a regular basis. I mean, I believe that if you're preaching twice on a Sunday, you've got 2 Sunday services, then in one of those services you should preach as if everybody in front of you is unconverted, at least in one of those services.
Okay.
Now, to do that, it's hard work. To do that, you know, you have to really work at, you know, variation, etc. But it can be done with hard work. It can be done, you know.
Thank you. Yeah, Alan, over to you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Powell, thank you so much for tonight. And it's so hard to get everything into 45, 50 minutes. Is there anything you think that we've missed or that you've missed that you want to say before we finish tonight?
Well, certainly with regard to, again, with regard to preaching, if I speak again to young men, you know, who are preaching, make sure you've got a message. It's not enough just to expound a passage, you know. And also on that same theme, don't imagine that if you've expounded a passage, you've preached the gospel automatically, because you haven't automatically preached the gospel. You know, the gospel is a message, but make sure you have a message. I mean, not long ago, a 91-year-old Christian phoned me. I'd known her for 50 years, and well, nearly 50 years, and she said this, which I thought was very perceptive with regard to some of the preaching she'd been hearing. She said, any one of us can buy a commentary and know what the text says or know what the passage is teaching. But she said, what we want is a message. You know? And I thought, well, I mean, that's just spot on. You know?
Yeah.
Absolutely spot on, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and this, you know, so much modern preaching it's more Bible study than actual preaching, you know. And you know, there's a big difference between, you know, or there can be a very big difference between the knowledge of the Bible and the knowledge of God. You know, you can know the Bible, but that doesn't automatically mean you know God, And so, the idea is that we've got to just, teach the Bible and get people to know the Bible. Well, no, I mean, the business of the preacher is to bring people to know God, Now, I know it's through the preaching of the word, of course, but, it's more than just knowledge of the content of the Bible. There's got to be a message. I mean, and the message, it informs the mind, it moves the heart, and it motivates the will, and that's what preaching is all about.
Well, thank you, Mr. Powell. I think that's an excellent place to leave it, and I'm sure everyone agrees that the need of the hour is preachers, for God to raise up preachers who have a message from himself. So thank you ever so much for tonight, and there's so much more we'd love to know, especially about your other pastorates, but time has run away from us. And again, we're meeting again next week at 8:15, and the minister who's joining us next week is the Reverend Andrew Davis. And so I'm sure many of you know Andrew Davis, and so please tune in for that. But for tonight, thank you so much, Mr. Powell, and we wish you a good evening, everyone who's listening in. Enjoy the rest of the bank holiday, and we'll see you next week at 8:15. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you.
God bless.